This is your government video for compromises at the Constitutional Convention. As we go through the Constitutional Convention, there becomes various camps, people who want to make major change, people who don't, people who disagree with certain things, and this video is going to go through some of those major compromises. The first thing that we're going to start with is Article 1. So Article 1 of the Constitution is the setup of the legislative branch of federal government. They spend most of their time here, over 50% of their time, trying to figure out how to set up the legislative branch and how to put representatives in the federal government. And obviously, large states and small states disagree about how to distribute power to each state. So the first major hurdle that they have to do is decide how to get representatives. Remember, they don't want taxation without representation, so this is really important. Ultimately, they decide on what's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise because they break for lunch after a day of very contentious debate over small states and large states, and the gentlemen from Connecticut come up with this compromise. It basically says we're going to create a two-house legislature. We're going to split it into two houses, which we call a bicameral legislature. And one of the chambers is going to be called the House of Representatives, and the House is going to be based on population, which is what the large states wanted. And you would get a certain amount of representatives for every population that you had. The second chamber is going to be called the Senate, and that is similar to what the small states wanted. They wanted equal representation for each state. So every state in the Union has 2 senators per state. And the House and the Senate have to work together to get laws passed. Once they decide that, they then have to have a debate about how to count population because the House of Representatives is determined based on population. This becomes one of the first major debates about slavery at the Constitutional Convention, and it will not be the last one. The southern states are still very dependent, or they believe they're very dependent on slavery for their economic system. In the north, many states have started to stop slavery, and there are lots of people at the Constitutional Convention that want to ban slavery in the Constitution. The southern states are going to create a voting bloc and basically say, if you don't allow us to have slavery, then we're going to make our own country and we will not be part of this new union. So this is one of those times where they make a compromise here to continue slavery throughout the colonies and in the United States. And they do this through the 3/5 clause. And the 3/5 clause says that slaves will be counted as 3/5 of a whole person for both the purposes of population counting and taxation. Because the southern states considered slaves to be their property, the North was arguing that they should pay property taxes based on property. And the South was saying, we don't want to pay taxes for our slaves, but we do want to count them for population so we get more power in the federal government's House of Representatives. The 3/5 clause was a very flawed way to compromise the counting of slaves. Also in Article 1, they will continue to debate whether or not to put in a ban on the importation of slaves. So they realize that the southern states are not going to allow them to put a clause that completely bans slavery. So the second idea is we'll ban the importation of new slaves. So in Article 1, they have this debate. Ultimately, the South also disagrees with this. They put in a clause that says they can't have a vote to ban slavery until after 1800. So this basically kicks the can down the road that they will continue slavery throughout the southern states or any state that wanted to continue it, and they couldn't have a debate about it for many years to come. As we get into Article 2 is on the setup of the executive branch. And for obvious reasons, the colonies were created because most people did not like England and they did not like the king and the laws that were set up and enforced by the king in England. So setting up of the presidency can have a lot of similarities to the way the king controls a country. So you have to be very careful in the way that you set up the presidency because citizens throughout the 13 colonies are ultimately going to have to vote on this new constitution. And if they believe that they are now creating somebody similar to a king, that's going to be problematic. So they have to figure out how to elect a president. So the first and most obvious way is we'll have an election, and based on the popular vote, we will have somebody win. The elites that are at the Constitutional Convention do not trust the average citizens to vote properly for president. The average voting citizen, they believe, is uneducated, ignorant, does not understand what's best for the country, that they're more likely to fall prey to demagogues. So if you don't trust people to make good choices, then the only way, another way that they could consider is having Congress pick the president. This is similar to a parliamentary system in Europe where the houses in parliament will choose the prime minister. If in our system we allowed the House and Senate to pick who is president, then that thus creates or eliminates the checks and balances system between the president and Congress. So if the president is beholden to the members of the House and Senate in order to win re-election, the president's just going to do whatever the majority of the House and Senate want, regardless of ideas. And in the system that we created in the Constitution, we want a lot of debate and discussion and some friction between the president and Congress. So they didn't like that idea. If you don't trust the popular election and you don't trust the political elites in Congress to pick the president, there's not a lot of other choices. So they make something up for the very first time. And the compromise here is the Electoral College. This is completely unique to the United States. And to this day, no other country has created an Electoral College the way that we do ours. For a very simple example of the Electoral College is the way that we select the President of the United States, and that is the only official other than the Vice President that is elected this way. Every state in the Union is given a number of electors in the Electoral College. The number of electors a state gets is equal to the amount of senators and representatives they have representing themselves. So you have a certain number of representatives based on your population, plus 2 for the senators. Now, the electors are not the same people as the senators and representatives. Electors for the Electoral College are actually elected from citizens of the state. Today, on your ballot, when you go to vote for the president and vice presidential team, there is a list of electors that have been chosen by that team's political party. So on a ballot, let's say that you're choosing between a Democratic team and a Republican team. If you decide to vote for the Republican president and vice president, the Republican Party has chosen a set of electors, and their names are on the ballot. And the Democratic president and vice president have a set of Democratic electors on the ballot. So you're actually not voting for the president. You're voting for a team of electors from a party who will then vote for the president in the Electoral College. Now, some states require that their electors take an oath of office that they will promise to vote for the candidate who's won the popular vote of the state. And other states do not require this. So it's possible that some electors can switch their vote. And we call those people faithless electors. There's also some other major compromises and disagreements that have to be ironed out in the Constitutional Convention. Remember, the Articles, in order to amend the Articles of Confederation, they needed unanimous support, 13 out of 13 states. So in Article 5 of the new Constitution, they set up an amendment. The amendment process is still difficult, but not very as difficult as the Articles. So here's the basics of how an amendment is added. You need a supermajority of the House and Senate. So that means a 2/3 vote of all House members and a 2/3 vote of all senators. The president does not have to sign a amendment or an article for an amendment. But it has to go on the ballot in each of the states, and at least 3/4 or 75% of the states have to pass the amendment. So it is a supermajority, which generally means that you need people from both parties in the House and Senate, and 75% of states to agree to amend the Constitution. And the biggest things that come out of the Constitution as in terms of debate are how much federal government is too much. Do we really want massive amounts of state government with very little federal? We tried that underneath the Articles of Confederation, and we had all these problems. So as we add a stronger federal government, where do we draw the line? How much federal government is too much? Do we always want the federal government to be stronger than states? And the second one is, when do the rights of the government in general take away the rights of individual rights of the people? So do we want the citizens to be sovereign and have a lot of individual freedoms where the state and federal government can't restrict them? And if we do want government control, would we prefer it to be federal or state? And these are two questions that are still debated today. And a lot of times our major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, debate these very two things.